Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth ELSI Genomics Network seminar for 2023. My name is Ainsley Newson, and I convene this network with fantastic support from Kitty Jean Laginha and also support from Australian Genomics. Thanks for either being here live today or for joining us to watch the recording. And I will start by acknowledging that we are coming together virtually, but for those of us in many places around the world, we are on unceded Aboriginal land. And for me, that is the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to acknowledge the tens of thousands of years of knowledge generation and sharing and care for country and each other that these traditions have enabled and are passing on to this day. I'd also like to acknowledge elders past and present, and of course, any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander folks who are either joining us live or watching this recording. So this has been a highly anticipated seminar. The questions that we're going to talk about today, I think, are so important to the future of genomics in Australia. Yet, as we'll come to see, there's quite a lot to unpack and quite a lot that we just don't know at the moment as well. So we have with us two speakers, Associate Professor Wendy Bonython and Associate Professor Megan Best, and both are experts in their own domains and know quite a lot about this topic. And so I'll just introduce both speakers now, and then we'll have Wendy present, followed by Megan. So Wendy Bonython is Associate Professor Wendy Bonython. She researches and teaches in health and medical law and ethics in both the law and medicine programs at Bond University, where she also has a very high-level fancy teaching role, as I understand it. Her research looks broadly at the regulation of emerging biotechnologies, including genetics and tissue samples, and also genomic and health data sets. And before she became an academic, she worked in government and health administration and policy, and also in technology regulation. So I think he's just so well placed to talk about this topic. And she also, just for extra, has a PhD in molecular medicine and has worked in a clinical and research setting too. So Wendy, thanks so much for joining us and for presenting today. And Associate Professor Megan Best is an Associate Professor at the Institute for Ethics and Society at the University of Notre Dame in Australia, but also has a position in the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney, where I also work. And Megan is a medical doctor and has worked a lot in palliative care for many, many years. And in 2017, she was awarded a Cancer Institute Fellowship to undertake postdoctoral research to look at the psychosocial, behavioural and ethical impact of genomic screening in cancer. And that fellowship was based in the Psycho-Oncology Cooperative Research Group, which is also known as POCOG at the University of Sydney in the School of Psychology. And she's also published extensively, in addition to lots and lots of research on psychosocial and ethical aspects of cancer genomics, also in the areas of spirituality in healthcare and psycho-oncology more generally, and also other bioethics publications. Megan, thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us today. It's lovely to have you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Wendy to share her screen and talk to us about more than the sum of my parts. And we're talking broadly about ownership of data and tissue and what this all means for genomic research and clinical practice in Australia going forward. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ainsley. I'm going to attempt over the next 15 minutes to shoehorn what's a really uncomfortable marrying up of very rigid formal legal traditions on an area of technology which is progressing in leaps and bounds. It's an area that doesn't necessarily result in a clear or coherent framework. And I guess I want to flag today that it's probably timely that we re-examine the relationship between particularly this idea of rights and property interests in genomic and biological materials. And we do it as a matter of some urgency, because the longer we delay it, the more unfit for purpose that space is going to become. I'd like to start by adding my own acknowledgement of country, in my case to pay my respects to the Yugambeh people of Southeast Queensland, where I'm presenting from today. I'd also like to note, however, that this presentation will contain references to ancestral remains, and that's something that may be culturally sensitive, particularly to some First Nations community members who are joining us today, but also to other people. While the focus of my presentation is on medical research and pathology sample collections, similar legal inconsistencies and anomalies arise in the context of ancestral remains and tissue samples that have been collected from Indigenous peoples for anthropological research. Some of those samples and remains taken from many Indigenous communities without consent to this day remain in museums, universities, and other collections in various parts of the world. And while some have been returned, work to bring about repatriation of many of those samples, remains, and artefacts is still ongoing, and many of the same principles will apply to those materials. In 1970, Justice Wendy of the High Court of Australia famously referred to law marching in step with medicine, but in the rear and limping a little. He could very well have been describing the legal landscape with respect to rights over human remains and biological samples. Over the next few minutes, I want to highlight why this matters to patients, or donors as they're more commonly styled in this context, and to their relatives increasingly, and to researchers, and essentially and ultimately to all of us. So a useful place to start with a topic such as this is why. Why do we want to own biological materials? Is ownership really the best method or framework for conceptualizing our relationship to these resources? What can we do with them? And this is, I think, the critical question, importantly, what might we be able to do with them in future? Okay. So historically, it turns out we couldn't do much with bodies at all. Once someone died, under ecclesiastic law, their earthly remains were merely nullius in vermibus, food for worms. They're the executor of somebody's estate, the person in charge of dealing with their affairs, had some legally recognised powers and duties which enabled them to arrange things such as laying out of the corpse or consecration and ultimately burial of the body. But those powers were extremely limited in scope, and they're not regarded as being proprietary or based in any sort of understanding of property. The executor didn't own the person's body or remains at all. And indeed, at law, there was a common law principle that expressly stated that there is no property in the body. And that principle certainly remains in place today, certainly in traditional frameworks, if not so much in practical reality. That principle is not, however, absolute, and it never has been. Even in early times, it was patently obvious that under some circumstances there could be property, or at least some commercial value, potentially leading to a market-type environment in some bodies and remains. And a good example of this was possession of holy relics by churches. Possessing those items was a signifier and indeed almost a guarantee of economic prosperity for many religious orders. And the sorts of relics in question are things like bones or hair or teeth, right the way through in some cases to entire mummified corpses. The better the quality of the relic, the greater its potency, the larger number of pilgrims who would travel to the order to pray in its presence, spending money on food and accommodation, and making gifts to the order in the process. Unsurprisingly, such relics were often jealously guarded, and orders would take extreme steps to exclude others from seeking to exercise control over or having access to them. And these are all clear indications that in the eyes of their custodians at any rate, there was something very similar to a commercial value or a property interest in these remains, even as far back as that time. More widespread and generalised use for remains emerged during the Renaissance period, when the study of human anatomy became particularly popular in Western Europe. By the 1800s, interest in studying human anatomy had spread throughout Britain and focused around Edinburgh in particular. The resurrection men, or the body snatchers, emerged in part as a solution to a limited supply of lawfully available bodies for dissection. These people would monitor graveyards for burials by day and then return at night to exhume recently buried corpses and then on-sell them to various anatomy schools for dissection. And These resurrectionist men highlight a particular weirdness within our law of property that arises from that principle of no property in the body. Because there was no property, you couldn't actually be charged with anything akin to theft or larceny or stealing a corpse, because in order to steal something, it must be a form of property. And of course, these weren't property. They expressly could not be considered so. If, however, the resurrectionist took the burial clothes the body was buried in, or some other trinket that the body was buried with, then they could potentially be charged and prosecuted, and indeed, in extreme cases, executed for a criminal act of interference with someone else's property. Legislation was eventually passed to close this legal loophole, but not before the development of a range of defensive measures designed to keep the resurrectionists away. And I've got here on the slide a picture of one such example. It's a mort safe, and if you travel to Perthshire in Scotland, you can still see these sorts of defences against corpse stealing and grave robbing in some of the older churchyards. As anatomy boomed, so too did interest in establishing collections, both private and public. Museums, art galleries, hospitals, and universities were, and in many cases still are, custodians of extensive collections of anatomical specimens. But they were also attractive to private collectors, and the famous Australian case of Doodlewood and Spence, which established an exemption to the no property in the body rule, involved such a sample. In this case, it consisted of an incompletely separated aborted twin fetus that was preserved in surgical spirits by the doctor who attended the delivery. After the doctor's death, the specimen ended up as part of an auction of his affairs to finalise his estate, and ultimately ended up in the hands of somebody who was operating a stand at a travelling carnival sideshow. He had an exhibit of curiosities that he used to charge admission for people to come and see. Widespread utility for explanted body parts further expanded with the development of technologies permitting, first of all, blood transfusion and then organ donation, and interdonation of tissues and samples to tissue or biobanks for research purposes. Almost invariably, these have been characterised as gifts, and this is a form of terminology which, although it appeals to altruism and served a purpose at the time it was rolled out, nonetheless masks a number of awkward legal realities. And I would suggest that some of these realities are so awkward and so ethically problematic that perhaps one of the things we should reconsider is the use and appropriateness of this idea of donation in the context of obtaining biological materials. From a legal perspective, there are two main issues with this characterisation. Firstly, in order to gift something at law, it must first of all be characterised as property. And again, we still have that extant principle of no property in the body. So technically, we're gifting something that can't actually be gifted from a legal perspective. Secondly, and perhaps even more importantly though, is that gifting carries a specific legal meaning. If you give something away, then essentially you're renouncing all rights and interests over it, not just commercial rights and not just rights over the physical aspects of the thing in question. And this is where I suggest that perhaps it might no longer be a great fit given some of the technological developments and some of the things that we know that patients who donate materials actually want going forward. There are, of course, other reasons why we might want to, or even be required to, keep collections of biological materials. Policy and accreditation guidelines require that biopsy tissues be retained for a certain period of time, often to facilitate things such as retesting, for example. For a long time, dried blood samples taken from newborns were routinely retained, often without parental knowledge or consent, for extended periods. And there have been multiple high-profile instances where hospitals, in investigating deaths, have retained tissue or organ samples without or in excess of consent for extended periods. Alternatively, there may be reasons why a donor or source of biological material, or even a family member, might want access to a sample or information about a sample, or information derived from a sample. It's also worth bearing in mind that technological developments mean now that virtually any biological sample or remains should also be considered as a source of genomic or genetic data. Conversion of that tangible property into intangible information means that essentially anytime we're talking about biological samples, we're implicitly also talking about genetic and genomic information and all of the ethical, legal, and social risks and benefits that entails. It's no longer sensible to think about there being a clear distinction between a tangible physical sample and derivative intangible genetic and genomic information or data. So what's the legal framework for people seeking to use or access or otherwise deal with human biological samples? While there is a legislative framework which captures some of the sets of circumstances that arise, it's by no means complete. It doesn't, for example, envisage circumstances under which a donor might want or require access to or information about a sample they've donated. Even less does it consider the possibility that a genetic or other relation of the donor might have a similar need. In those cases where legislation doesn't provide an answer, it's been largely left to the courts to find solutions based on the common law or alternative legislative frameworks. As mentioned, the common law starts with that no property in the body principle. But as noted on the previous slide, there are exceptions, including the exception established in the case of Ditterwood and Spence. In that case, the High Court of Australia found that there was property in the exhibit because of the investment of work and skill in the process of preserving it in spirits. That work and skill was not particularly expert or onerous, nor, interestingly, was it undertaken by either of the parties to the dispute. In that case, the plaintiff or the appellant was the exhibitor, and the defendant, the person who held the sample that he was trying to obtain access to, was an inspector of police who had confiscated it. Neither of the parties was, in fact, a relation to either the mother whose fetus it was or the fetus itself. They were both strangers to that biological material. And a consequence of that is that this case doesn't tell us anything about whether or not any rights that may have arisen from the exercise of that work or skill would have superseded any rights that the original source of that material may have had. 105 years later, in the case of Clark and McCourt, the High Court accepted without serious question that sperm samples that had been transferred as part of a sale of business and were subsequently found to be unusable could be regarded as property. In that case, the purchaser of a fertility clinic was seeking to recover the costs of replacing the samples from the vendor. And at no point was it seriously questioned by the court whether the no property rule should be applied or even considered. Nor did they quibble at the proposition that sperm could be replaced in much the same manner as other commodities, notwithstanding policy concerns about commodification that were evident throughout the relevant assisted reproductive technology provisions in the legislation, as well as assisted reproductive technology ethical codes and guidelines. Clark and McCourt also involved two strangers to the samples. A UK case based on similar facts, but brought by the donors, or more accurately sources of the materials, highlighted other common law jurisdictional challenges arising from this common law approach of no property. In Yearworth and North Bristol, a group of young men undergoing treatment for cancer had arranged to bank semen with the NHS in anticipation of future fertility loss. The banked semen was destroyed. The men sued the NHS. Ultimately, the UK Court of Appeal reiterated the no property in the body principle. However, they also found that the men had some proprietary right over it based on an intention to control it. This decision has been criticised extensively because it doesn't really fit with our traditional legal conceptions of what property actually is. The outcome may have been the correct one, but the reasoning doesn't sit particularly well. Alongside these decisions, there are an array of other decisions by inferior courts dealing with property or property-like uses of recovered or stored biological material. These include, for example, the long line of cases establishing the circumstances under which sperm may be posthumously retrieved from a recently deceased male, or stored by a recently deceased male may be used for future ART procedures. Additionally, there are other cases, such as Roche and Douglas, where a potential child of a deceased person has been allowed to access stored tissue for the purposes of determining parentage to finalise an estate. In James and Seltsam, the court ordered that under the rules of discovery, biopsied lung tissue from a plaintiff could be released for further testing in order to determine issues of medical causation in support of a negligence claim. While in all of these cases there's some characterisation of a property right, in many instances the question of whose property it is goes unanswered, and the scope and nature of the rights is at best only quasi-proprietary in nature. Other issues highlighting some of these challenges arise from rights of access to benefits of research. Most people will be familiar with the litigation around, for example, Greenberg and Miami Children's Hospital and Moore and University of California in the US, where people whose biological materials were subsequently used to develop patented diagnostic tests or cell lines were excluded from having any right to any of the proceeds of that development in research. And of course, most people will also be familiar with the case of Henrietta Lacks, which really highlighted a lot of the limitations around traditional conceptions of property and proprietary rights, as well as some of the challenges around consent and adequacy and equity in this space. So our legislation as we currently have it mostly dates back to between 1978 and 1985. Amendments to the Human Tissue Acts and Transplantation and Anatomy Acts have largely been fairly minimal. They still refer heavily to the idea of donation, implicit in which is an alienation of all rights of a donor. And they also disregard any idea that the donor's family members or relations might have some rights or interests in that material. What sort of rights or interests might that be? Well, it might be as simple as knowing where their material's going, what it's being used for, to be informed of any progress or research breakthroughs based on their contribution to that research. Will it be transferred to other people? Will it be stored offshore? And of course, as soon as you start talking about transforming biological samples into genomic and genetic data sets and informational sets, those implications and questions are just magnified. So our current position is that generally we have a rule that says there's no property in the body, except for those cases where there is. And at the moment, the exceptions seem to outweigh the general principle. But it's not necessarily clear what property is in this context, what the relevant property rights are, or who those rights vest in. We've had widespread call for statutory reform, including by judges who have repeatedly indicated that this is a matter best addressed by the legislature. What are some of the things that reform might consider? Some proposals suggest doing away with the idea of property entirely, or treating biobanks and derivative data as a form of commons, property of everyone, but also no one. Both of these present significant challenges, not least of all to the commercial funding framework on which much research presently rests, as well as the broader legal system. Other considerations include arguments that we should be referencing a lot of our legislation in terms of things like Article 15B of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications, taking more of a human rights perspective on it. Others suggest that perhaps more nuanced models of consent or more robust guidelines and regulatory frameworks might offer some solutions. Based on the treatment of those things in Clark and McCourt, I'm not sure that they're sufficiently robust. Ultimately, it's clear that legislative reform is likely to be needed, but it needs to be the result of a co-design process in which researchers, sources rather than donors, and other stakeholders are all adequately represented.
Thank you so much, Wendy. That was incredible. Such a rich account of a really technical area of law in a very short amount of time. So thank you for putting that together and explaining it so well to us. I think we will hold questions until after Megan's presentation as well, unless there are any urgent points of clarification for Wendy on the basis of her talk. And I should add, if you do have a question, it will be much easier for Kitty and myself if you use the raise hand function. But I can't see anyone waving at me madly. Start thinking about your questions for the more general discussion as well. And in the meantime, Megan, I will hand over to you to present some of the results that came out of the PiGeOn study regarding ownership of samples and information. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you, Ainsley, and thank you for this opportunity to share the research with everyone today. Once again, thank you very much for the chance to talk to you today. Wendy's outlined the legal side of things very helpfully, and now let's hear from the patients. I'm going to discuss some empirical research we've done with advanced cancer patients who have undergone genetic testing on excised tumour tissue. The test in question is molecular profiling, and it looks for biological markers in the tumour that may be used to target therapy for the individual patient. Molecular profiling is increasingly used in oncology. However, knowledge of the meaning of genetic variation is still developing, so the test is commonly undertaken in the research context. This often requires obtaining access to samples in the research program. The researchers have to access samples which were excised in the clinical setting. Tissue samples are stored in a variety of settings, both public and private, and consequently there's confusion among patients, physicians, researchers, and institutions regarding who owns and can access this previously excised tissue for testing, as well as who should pay for any processing involved. In cancer care, human tissue is usually excised for diagnostic or treatment purposes. All sampled and processed diagnostic tissue must be retained for future diagnostic use in case it should be needed for a minimum set period of between 7 and 20 years, depending on local requirements. In some situations, this tissue may be accessed for research purposes. While patients have control over tissue while it is in their body, the act of excision can be seen as changing their relationship to the material. Similarly, when patients donate tissue for research purposes, they are often considered to have gifted or donated their tissue, as Wendy mentioned. Nonetheless, there remains significant argument among stakeholders regarding who actually owns this tissue, particularly if knowledge or profit may accrue from its use. A key concern regarding property in tissue in the cancer concept and in the context of molecular profiling is what might happen if the expectations and understanding of patients and that of the current custodians of the tissue are not aligned. So in order to understand how cancer patients view ownership and use of their own tissue, we conducted a mixed method study of patients who were already participating in a research program which undertakes molecular profiling on diagnostic tissue for combined clinical and research purposes. Participants were recruited to a cancer genomics study, the Molecular Screening and Therapeutics Program, which is known as MOST. It's being conducted at the Garvan Institute of Medical Research in Sydney, and you can see it there on the left-hand side of the slide. MOST is recruiting adult patients with confirmed advanced or metastatic cancer who have exhausted their therapeutic options. So they're either on the last line of treatment or they have run out of options entirely. To be eligible for this study, the patients need sufficient accessible tumor tissue in storage somewhere. Molecular profiling is performed on that tissue, and if an actionable variant is found, participants who are then enrolled in a related therapeutic trial if it's available. The PiGeOn project is a longitudinal mixed method psychosocial sub-study of MOST, which aims to examine the psychosocial and behavioural impacts of molecular profiling and the ethical issues which are involved. And while the PiGeOn project addresses a broad range of questions, today I'll just focus on participant views regarding the ownership and use of tissue. All participants were asked to complete a questionnaire at the time consent was given, which was prior to testing. And this included questions relating to their views regarding who owns and can access excised tissue and who should pay for the processing. We also asked them to complete measures of knowledge of genomics and health literacy. A subset of patients were asked to participate in a semi-structured interview. 356 participants completed the questionnaire, which gave us a 90% response rate. Participant gender was broadly representative of the population, with 52% female and an average age of 37 years. A third had university education and 20% spoke a language other than English at home. Participants scored a mean of 64.6 out of 100 on the knowledge of genomic sequencing measure and a mean of 8.4 on health literacy scales. This indicates moderate knowledge of genomics and health literacy. So it's a reasonably well-educated group compared to the general population, and for most of them, this was the first time they underwent genetic testing. Only a third of patients were aware that tumor tissue removed at surgery was routinely kept in storage for 7 years. Half the participants, here we go, believe that they or their next of kin should own diagnostic tissue, with the next largest group, 20%, believing that the entity storing the tissue, which is usually the pathology lab, should own it. We then asked them, who do you think actually does own it? Only a third believe that they or their next of kin did own the tissue, and a quarter thought that the pathology lab owned the tissue. Just over half, 56%, believe they should control access to diagnostic tissue, that is, be able to decide how the tissue was used. And when it came to the question of who should pay for preparation of the tissue for any particular use, most participants, 2/3, believe that the government should pay on the basis that they're the primary health funder in the study setting. In the qualitative in the qualitative work, we interviewed 23 participants and 3 qualitative themes were identified. The first was the move from ownership to custodianship of tissue samples. Overall, the participants had quite diverse views and understandings regarding who might own in terms of having complete control over tissue samples and when the sample is deemed to have been given away or donated to others. Some participants viewed the body as a boundary beyond which, once surgically removed, tissue no longer belonged to the person from which it had come. They acknowledged a change in the form, function, and use of such tissue once it left their body. Furthermore, they felt that in consenting to its removal, they'd given responsibility for the sample over to those who had removed it. One patient said, "Once they take it out of me, that's it. I mean, you can put it in the rubbish bin or you can put it in the store and you can use it. You know, it's not mine anymore." However, a few participants felt that since the tissue came from them, they should be consulted about its use. Some participants also reported that their doctor or the research team had told them that their consent would be sought for any future use, reflecting a sense of choice that remains with patients to determine what happens to the sample collected. One patient said, "My oncologist told me that I owned it. I had to give permission if it was to be used again." However, some patients talked more in terms of custodianship. Custodianship refers to the notion that one has an obligation of caretaking or safeguarding a sample on behalf of another, from initial collection to participation and or consultation in decision-making around the storage and use of the sample. With this term, a relationship between the sample and the patient allows for diverse views on what the tissue represents, who is now responsible for storing samples, and the degree to which the patient might wish to be included in any decision-making about the sample. Some participants believed that once removed from their body, tissue was no longer their property, that is, they didn't own it, but rather custodianship of the sample would be the responsibility of those who could use it best, which was usually the medical and research staff. Custodianship becomes a responsibility and ethical obligation of those seeking to store and use the samples. Participants felt that these staff had the expertise to decide what the best use of the tissue would be. And there was a high level of trust that in making these decisions, the staff would treat the excised tissue with respect and make ethical decisions regarding its use. Some participants also mentioned that the government, who are responsible for the relevant legislation and regulation of this, should have a role to play in ensuring ethical use of excised tissue. One patient said, "The patient doesn't have the skills or knowledge or capacity to really own it. We would give that responsibility to someone else, like the government, because they set laws and regulations around various medical issues and probably pass the legislation." Sorry, one more point for that. In terms of consent, after the sample, most participants didn't want to be continuously contacted to provide consent to future uses of the sample. However, if results from future studies had implications for their own health or the health of their family, they did wish to be notified. Those few participants who felt greater ongoing custodianship over their tissue, however, they believe that their consent should be sought for any future use, and each future use and that they should be informed of any outcomes. This was because the tissue had come from their body and could have implications for themselves or future generations. The second theme to be considered is that, that the value of excised tissue changes over time and between cultures. Some participants felt that once tissue had been in one body, Once they felt that there was tissue in their body that was malfunctioning, such as in cancer, it had a malicious quality and it was dangerous, and that it needed to be removed. It needed to be removed, and the act of removal had value for the individual. But once it was removed, the tissue no longer had the same negative connotation, and instead takes on the value of its potential use, either for diagnosis or research. The information or knowledge generated from that sample has inherent value, both to the individual for which it came and also from the society at large. Some individuals noted that individuals from some cultures and religions may value excised tissue differently, requiring that it be returned to the body when they die, so that bodily integrity is maintained at burial. In that case, the value to the individual would trump any value to society. And the third theme related to ethical issues underlying who should pay for tissue processing. A few participants believed that if there was potential benefit for the person who provided the sample, that they should pay for storage and its use. But as a qualification, there was a realization that some people may not be able to afford to pay for it, in which case the government or the institution storing the sample should pay. And the reason for this was so that there would be equity with no disadvantage to any individuals. Some participants saw the stored tissue as a community resource, which had potential to benefit everybody through research findings. And in that sense, storage and use should be paid for by the government. And finally, a few participants believed that whoever considered the tissue useful and wanted to use it, including researchers and medical institutions, they should pay. So if researchers want to use the tissue for research, they should pay for it. This isn't so clear-cut for studies such as most, however, where boundaries between research and clinical use are blurred. So in this study of patients undergoing molecular profiling as part of a research study, attitudes to ownership of excised tissue were diverse. Many of our participants addressed issues of ownership and responsibility for directing its use in terms of custodianship. Custodianship in this context represents an ongoing relationship to the tissue one has extracted from one's body while ceding expertise for decision-making to another. 2 points of discussion that arise from our findings are firstly, that community education and guidelines are needed to guide practice in this area in order to establish clarity and alignment between patient expectations of responsibilities and the role of custodians around tissue samples. Secondly, while it's widely recognised that clinical trials provide clinical benefit to patients, clinical trials often depend on access to tissue, such as with molecular profiling. Staff involved in research and clinical practice have different priorities, and clarity is needed to work out how these conflicting priorities can be accommodated. One possible solution is to actually take more tissue at the time of surgery so that conflict arises less often. In conclusion, as diagnostic tissue becomes an increasingly valued research for both clinical and research purposes, its ownership and conditions of use remain controversial topics. While most guidelines do not recognise patient ownership, they do encourage consideration of patient preferences and wishes. Most of our participants were willing to cede custodian rights to their medical institutions and trusted them to make ethical decisions about its use. However, they did expect to be notified of any results that were obtained through use of the tissue, particularly if it was of relevance to them. Some were actually willing to pay for that. Regardless of the intended purpose, respectful and considerate use of diagnostic tissue is expected by patients who provide it, and this should be woven into governance about its use. I'd just like to thank all the collaborators with whom I worked on the PiGeOn project, and you can see there was a cast of thousands. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Megan. Really clear presentation. And I think we're just beginning to see actually that how complex this is, and the language, the scenarios, expectations, and this is just one example. Like Megan's research is about tumour testing in patients who are very unwell. And so once we start thinking about other scenarios too, we can start to see just how complicated this might be. But yeah, two wonderful presentations. So we're now going to open things up for discussion, and you're welcome to ask a question of either or both presenters. And please, to help us, use the raise hand function, or you're very welcome to type your question into the chat, and we can either then get you to read it out or we can read it out on your behalf. And Kitty and I have also got a few questions up our sleeve if you'd like to hear them. But Sri has already raised their hand. So Sri, I'll give you the floor. Feel free to unmute and ask your question. Hi.
Hi. My question is to Megan. Actually, I work in a company where we are also into cancer, diagnostics, and especially for targeted therapies for cancer patients. Now, my question is that, say, suppose most of the time, almost like 30% of these cancer patients, pass away, post the treatment or whatever. So in that case, what would be the, kind of ethical or regulatory concerns would be there if I were to use that, the data of that particular patient to continue in my research or, to write papers, etc. That was my question.
I'm sorry, can I just clarify, are you referring to the genetic data rather than the tissue itself?
Yes, genetic data, because tissue I don't think is going to be staying, stay with us for a long time. So I'm talking about the genetic data.
Once genetic data has been handed over, I'm not aware of any restrictions on its use after the time of death. Wendy, are you aware of any restrictions? As far as I'm concerned, once it's in the data set, it stays there.
Okay.
Yeah, this is actually a really interesting one, and it's something that became, I think, a bit more of a consideration in the aftermath of the Henrietta Lacks case that I mentioned briefly in passing. One of the things that happened shortly after publication of her book was that one of the major molecular genetics research institutes actually published the entire genome of the strain of HeLa cells, which were the cells that were taken from her. And one of the problems with that was she'd been deceased for a long period of time. The cells were transformed and they were no longer identical to what they would have been in her originally, but there was nonetheless the potential for a whole lot of information to be worked out and inferred about her descendants. So what do we do with genetic information obtained from people prior to their death after they've died? This is something that we don't have a clear legal framework governing. In that case, it ended up being a negotiation between her family and the institution. And the agreement that they reached was they actually restricted access to that sequence data. But that's not really a sustainable model of resolution of these types of issues going forward. Can we deal with it in consent? Can we say, okay, well, your data, if it's included in a data set, once you die, it will still be part of that data set. Does it matter if we've waved around the language of saying, oh, well, once it's included, we de-identify it, so we can't pull it out? We know that that's pretty much a fiction too. So there's not really a good, clear legal framework for governing this kind of thing. Possibly the answer is in
maybe
consent.
inclusion of this particular sentence in the consent form itself would be a start, maybe.
Yeah,
I think that's a great idea.
But it's still not necessarily going to be legally enforceable. So it's a tricky one.
This is an area that's under increasing scrutiny because on the other side, there's not much awareness of genetics in the palliative care setting, which is my clinical background, and we're doing research looking at the views within the palliative care context where there may not have been any genetic testing done, but the family want a sentinel case and, you know, with cancer to be identified to assist with risk screening amongst the family. And so there is work in this space, working out how best to manage the genetic data of deceased patients. As we get better at screening, it will become more important. But thank you, that's a very good question.
And I would add, to my knowledge, I can think of maybe 2 academic papers that have been written on this in the Australian setting. I think both are in the Journal of Law and Medicine. One is from a few years ago, and I think the other is a little bit more recent, but I think it's definitely unmapped territory from a specific regulatory perspective. So a question I have, and I think both of you could answer it from your own perspectives, because the way I see it, we've got quite a lot of uncertainty here. We've got a mismatch of case law. We've got regulation that may or may not be consistent across states and territories in Australia, let alone international guidelines. We've got calls based in things like the right to benefit, whereas Australia doesn't have any human rights sort of specific legislation, at least as I understand it. And on the other hand, we've also got people who, you know, want clarity about what's happening to them at the end of the day and want the right to be able to access additional treatments without necessarily having to undergo additional biopsy, particularly if that biopsy is an invasive one. So if you could wave, both of you, if you could wave a magic wand and have a solution presented, I guess what would that look like? Would it be specific regulation? Does it need to be legal, or could it just be in a softer form of regulation? Would it be specific to this instance, or do we need to not be exceptionalist here because that carries its own kind of dangers? So I guess if someone just said, you've got one wish and you can make this happen, what would that be? I'll ask you first, Wendy, and then I'll go to you, Megan.
Trying to narrow it down to one's the tricky bit. I'd love to say it could be done through ethics and regulation. The pragmatist in me says there needs to be the enforceability of law, simply because all of the examples that I've talked about are cases where we've either seen ethical guidelines not be followed, regulation hasn't had teeth. There needs to be law, but it needs to be a law based on broad-based consultation. I mentioned co-design before. It needs to have enough flexibility to pick up those plurality of rights and interests that Megan outlined so eloquently in her presentation. Not every patient wants the same thing, but there should be a system in place which picks up and reflects and makes space for some of those differences.
Thank you. How about you, Megan?
Yes, I agree. We need the flexibility in the model that patient desires can be accommodated, and it's quite obvious that that different patients have different levels of interest in their own health information. And some, in fact, have increased in uncertainty if you give them more information. So they need to be protected from being given information they don't want. One thing that comes to mind is the way that ethical guidelines in assisted reproduction are managed, which is with laws which need to be followed in order to be accredited. So it's got teeth in that you can't be accredited if you don't follow the ethical guidelines, but you still have a bit more flexibility than if it was just legislation in because as the technology is changing so quickly, you really need to have the ability to change the way you manage the data when it could be different in a few years' time.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's always useful to look to examples of regulation in other spheres that seem to work well and offer a bit of flexibility. And I think we can also maybe come on in a few minutes' time to questions around preferences and ensuring that preferences are genuine and things like that too. But in the meantime, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. And the first question is from Lisa, Lisa Melton. Lisa, I'm just wondering, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Or if you don't, I'm very happy to ask it on your behalf.
My mic doesn't work well.
That's okay, we got you now.
So I was really interested in the sort of attitudes and the openness to the interesting attitudes, I guess, that were picked up in Megan's study, and sort of quite a lot of clarity really about the patients or the contributors of tissue, their ownership and use, and the openness to the use of their tissue. Were any questions asked about whether those attitudes would be the same if the tissues were used for commercial purposes, as opposed to that, because your study was very clearly about clinical and research purposes, were there different attitudes picked up in relation to potential commercial use?
We didn't raise the issue of commercial benefit, and none of the patients raised it themselves. We did specifically talk about costs involved in processing of tissue. And the main message that came through the patient cohort was that nobody be disadvantaged if they couldn't afford the processing required to get the benefits from genetic testing. I think we have to remember that knowledge of genetics, knowledge of health literacy, the health literacy levels were moderate, even though it was quite a well-educated cohort. But it may not have crossed the minds of anyone we were speaking to that was a possibility.
Thank you. It's just really interesting in the light of the healer, situation.
Nobody mentioned it.
Yeah,
no one mentioned it.
Interesting.
And we try not to put ideas into their heads.
Yeah, I mean, it could also have been an artifact of the study setting, been through the Garvan, for example, and accessing the care that they were receiving through a research protocol. I don't know if that would have influenced it. I'm not aware of any other research about tissues specifically either. There is a little bit about commercial influence in the biobank setting. There was a study led by then Centre for Values, Ethics, Law and Medicine, now Sydney Health Ethics. It's one that comes to mind around global biobanking and commercial influence there. And participants in that study were relatively skeptical about sharing with commercial entities, which is probably not surprising, and also were very, very skeptical about tissue or information leaving Australia, so which was quite interesting too. So I mean, that's just one example, but it's one that I know about off the top of my head. But I think this is an area where we can, there's certainly more scope for research here for sure.
Can I just say that?
Of course, Megan.
This was a cohort of advanced cancer patients. They'd run out of treatment options. They were facing imminent death. And we do know that in these populations, there's a very high level of altruism. Most people want to give something back, particularly people in a research setting. They're very grateful. In other parts of the PiGeOn project, they talked about how aware they were that they were being treated through the generosity of previous patients who'd been enrolled in research projects. And so this level of altruism that now it's my turn to give back was very high. I didn't talk about that aspect of our findings, but it was definitely there in this cohort.
Thank you. Eliza, I know your camera is not working. You've posted two great questions in the chat. I'm wondering if you'd like to ask one or both of those questions, or if you're happy for me to read them out for you.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to one of them. I'll do the long-winded one because it's probably the one that might generate a bit of discussion. But I just have a question about the practicality of ownership of genomic data and or biospecimens. So in the Zero Childhood Cancer program, Chris Ballister, it's really been largely driven by Chris, but I've had the absolute pleasure of working on it with her. We've attempted to develop a bit of a policy and procedure around such requests. But what's quite interesting is that there's definitely understandable anxiety from healthcare providers, because I guess we think about all the potential risks that can come from such a return. And perhaps we don't think about the the good motivations that may be associated with such requests. But I was able to do a little bit of a focus group with the Zero Parent stakeholder group. And, you have to preface this with a bit of a disclaimer where they're a very self-selected group, very motivated group, and they're quite small, so they don't necessarily reflect the perceptions and feelings and motivations of all the parents of children in the trial. But it was actually a really interesting experience for me, because the motivations that they described were really not reflective of the concerns of the healthcare professionals. And I think it's a bit similar to what Megan was talking about in the MOST trial, where these are adults who, this is the last line of treatment. It's a similar thing in the PRISM phase of Zero, in that they're children with very poor prognosis cancer. So these are parents that are just desperate to turn whatever stone they can and feel like they've tried everything that they can to help their child survive. And I just wonder how we juggle these different and conflicting feelings. And I guess particularly how context influences those potential motivations. It might be different if the prognosis is very good, and then, I guess how that decision to get that data or biospecimen back and the subsequent use of those data and biospecimens might then impact that person in their lifetime. So I'd be curious to hear from both Megan and Wendy, and your talks are just wonderful. Thank you.
Megan, do you want to go first?
So just to clarify, the question is, how do we balance all these different interests?
Yeah, I guess. Some strategies, I guess.
I think a lot of the problems that we became aware of, particularly in the qualitative work in PiGeOn, was just lack of communication between researchers, clinicians, and patients. As you saw, a minority of patients were aware that their tissue had even been stored. They didn't realize that it didn't disappear at the time of surgery, so they didn't know it was there. As I'm very strongly in my palliative care shoes, but I believe communication can solve a lot of these problems. And I think that by making each party aware of the facts and having an opportunity to articulate their interests will go a long way in resolving a lot of these problems.
Yeah, I'd probably just add to that I understand anxiety about risks, but sometimes the appropriate response to a risk is to look for ways of mitigating it rather than just to completely avoid it by denying access. I think that's a problematic response. Just because the healthcare provider is anxious about risks, maybe a better approach is to educate people about what those risks are and bring it back to that process of communication rather than just say, no, we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't let this happen. That to me is a bit paternalistic. It diminishes the autonomy of, in this case, the parent or the patient. And I'm not sure that it necessarily achieves what they think it wants to in the most effective way. I think rather than saying, well, we're not going to give you this because you might do something dangerous with it, the better approach is to say, okay, we can support you in how you use it or explain why. It's similar to releasing a lot of genetic information. People say, well, we can't release that back because the person won't know what to do with it. They'll focus on the relative risk factor and do something radical like engage in fairly reactive measures because they don't understand it. Well, the solution is not to hide that information from them, because in reality they can get it via other channels. The better approach, I think, is to actually explain and educate. Yes, this is what your finding is. This is what it actually means.
And genetic counsellors are very important in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't just hand it over and leave them to sink or swim on their own. Actually provide that translational support alongside it.
Yeah, I think that's quite reassuring to hear, because I think, and Chris has got her hand up so she can jump in, but I think that's kind of the approach that we're trying to take. And communication is really important, but I think sometimes the provider patient, there's a power dynamic that can often challenge that ability to have those open discussions. And so we are taking the approach of having a third party that's not involved, that is a genetic counsellor, to be the conduit of that communication process. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Thank you.
Good.
Hi everyone, I'm back. I don't know what happened. I disappeared. I'm not quite sure at what point I disappeared, but Chris, I was going to ask you if your question was directly on Eliza's point or different. So I just welcome you either way, because you carried on beautifully without me, to ask your question now.
Look, thank you. And it is following on from Eliza. It's been such a pleasure working with Eliza on this project. And, you know, we conducted a Delphi survey of clinicians and researchers and laboratory people about returning raw genomic data to participants in the Zero study, because it had happened, but it was on an ad hoc basis, and there were tensions from both the parents and the clinicians. There was no clear pathway. And so the outcome has been the development of a policy, a CCI policy, and a process document, which will be provided to all clinicians to follow. In the patient information sheet, there'll be reference that this is available. So it's exactly what you've been saying. Everybody needs to be on the same page here and aware of, you know, what is available and what is the process. And often these were parents. And so I have spoken with a different group of parents as well. There is a group called Australian Families for Genomics, who are passionate about being able to take control of the raw genomic data, send it to other research groups who might be able to find an answer that Zero didn't find. And certainly the process involves making all parties aware of not only the challenges, and I like to talk about the outcomes, because the outcomes are not only risks. You know, they could be benefit, and there is a perception by the families that there is potential benefit. The other thing is, it's based on a principle of reciprocity, that in return for donation of your sample to the researchers who are custodians of the information and the samples, and I love the fact that, Megan, you've used those words, because it's exactly what they are, and can then be returned as long as it is returned in a safe way. And the role of the genetic counsellor, I know I'm biased, but the role of the genetic counsellor here is integral, because it is stepping away from that, in this case with childhood cancer, you know, is so integral and so important to what is happening with their child. And you know, they don't want to do anything that would impair that relationship at all, but at the same time they want to have it's a really, really important area. Thank you.
Thanks for that input, Chris. Wendy or Megan, do you have anything additional to add in light of those further comments?
I think Chris articulated really well that how sometimes doctors and researchers can be really worried about risks to the patient, which just don't bother them at all. And we need to be sensitive to that.
Yeah, it's a nice segue, actually. Oh, sorry, Wendy, did I cut you off then?
Yeah, I was actually just going to say, I really like the use of the term reciprocity there. I think there's been far too much emphasis. I'm not saying altruism is a terrible model, but I'm saying there needs to be some buyback in. Patients aren't just necessarily out to make whatever they can from the commercialization of their biomaterials. That's often not what's front and center of their mind. It's part of respecting them to recognize that, well, actually, maybe they do want to be informed. Maybe they do want a bit more information. And it is that sense of reciprocity rather than I'm going to make an anonymous donation and never hear anything more about it.
I think we also have to remember that in the context of genetics, we're talking about information which has implications for the family, and certainly the urgency of getting feedback in our cohort was the fact that they were advanced cancer patients and they wanted to know if any of the information would impact their family. Sometimes it was not, they weren't even concerned about the impact for themselves, but they were definitely interested in any implications for family members.
Thank you. A couple of further comments in the chat. One from Michelle about, the importance of consent here and discussing limitations and benefits, plus alternatives so that patients can feel empowered. So I think that's a really key thing. And further from Eliza saying that actually just knowing that this opportunity to obtain the information back to them was enough for them to feel that they had what they needed, and they may not necessarily go ahead and ask for it, but they liked knowing that it was an opportunity. So, if we're thinking about regulatory structures or, I hesitate to use the word ownership now, actually, but whatever word we land on, regardless of how that kind of falls down legally, if there are avenues for engagement from those who are providers, donors, there's another word, Wendy, what's the other word? Sources, yes, of tissue and data, that's really important. But another aspect to this, which is something Kitty and I chatted about in the lead up, is this question of co-design. And I think, we've heard really good testimony from different groups, different stakeholders here. And what we've also heard, though, is that the language is unbelievably complex, and the terminology that we land on can be really meaningful and also could lead the debate in particular ways, either intended or otherwise. And the same terms are likely to be understood by different groups in different ways. And so I guess if we're, talking about reciprocity, talking about appropriate engagement, if we're going to go forward and meaningfully have a conversation about this, then what are some of the rules for engagement? What are some of the ways that we can do this in a genuinely while trying to get to a bit more clarity than we have at the moment? Because I certainly feel that the uncertainty of the current status quo is causing lots of problems. It's causing problems for everyone, I think. So and whether it be a research or a clinical context, or thinking ahead to potential population health in the future, I think we need a bit more clarity, and we need that to be arrived at in a way that brings lots of people along as part of the conversation. But so I'm keen to hear your thoughts on how we might do that.
Can I add one more complication?
Sure.
Oh, one thing we found in the PiGeOn study was that there wasn't an awareness that the data was being collected by researchers in a project which had a limited timeline, and what happens to data once the research project finishes and the money's used up and the researchers move on to the next project. So I think that's an extra dimension when it's a research project collecting the data as to how the feedback loop will work. And one way that our research team suggested might overcome the problem in our context of cancer was to indeed hand the raw data over to the patient, and put the onus on the patient to check in with a genetic counselling team on a regular basis to see if there are any updates in terms of the meaning of their genome sequencing. Because as we know, we're learning more all the time, and the significance of findings and the status of VUSs can change over time. And that way, it would be so easy to overburden genetic services by saying, well, you now have the obligation to follow up all your patients you've ever tested forever. We don't expect that in any other area of medicine, so it seems unfair to expect it in genetics. But if the patient who was motivated to learn more wanted to, they would then have the information that they could take for review. Though it's possible with the advancement of technology, the other thing is just to be tested again if they wanted the information.
Yeah. And there, I'll let you speak in a minute, Wendy. Just a couple of things on that. I think one is, there is a school of thought that actually a sequence done now is not going to be anywhere near as good as a sequence done in 5 years' time. Although, speaking again to other scientists, they say, no, that, lots of bits of the genome are going to stay the same. And actually, it doesn't matter if you sequence them at 20 depth or 10 depth, the outcome of the testing is going to give you the same sequence. But, there's other regions of the genome that the greater the depth of sequencing, the better the accuracy of the information that you're going to glean from it. So, yeah, and I think with regards to handing it all over to participants, I think that sounds great. It would just require a fair amount of support, I think, as well, in the sense of making sure that people can retain over time that they have this information and that there might be a need for them to go back. I would want to make sure that it is one of a few different ways to try and provide support to patients, but it's probably better than nothing at all, I would say, in the sense of information just disappearing into the ether once the research study has concluded, because the national statement itself is pretty clear, I think, that there is no ongoing obligation after the conclusion of a project to continue to engage. And I think it's just there for pragmatic reasons more than anything else. And actually, just a quick self-plug, my colleague, Dr. Gabrielle Watts, and I have got a paper that's out already online first in the Journal of Medical Ethics, but coming out in the paper issue in December about this question of the obligation to reanalyze. And it's there with 4 commentaries from other experts globally around this obligation. But there is a small but active literature on this question coming out. So I just put in a quick plug for those of you who are super interested in this topic. We've got a paper on it. But Wendy, I'll ask you as well around this question of co-design, but also this question that's come up in a few of the questions so far around handing data over as one mechanism to foster, I guess, co-engagement, or even if we don't want to call it co-ownership, but a shared sense of belonging to the data in one kind or another, or shared sourcing of data. So yeah, what are your thoughts in that area?
I think the starting point for any co-design looking at reforming this area has got to be developing a common terminology. When these frameworks were introduced, it was a much, much more straightforward world. It was, okay, we can characterize this as donation because there's not really anything else that you might want to do with it apart from commercialization or commodification. And yeah, we don't want to go there. We're living in a far more sophisticated world now, but we're still talking in very basic concepts such as ownership, donation. We need a lot more nuance, and in order to get that, we actually need to make sure that people are using the same terminology to mean the same thing. Once we reach that baseline, I think then we can start looking at ways of actually implementing some of those frameworks and ideas and ensuring that there is enough flexibility around the systems that we put in place to capture those more nuanced and more sophisticated requirements.
Yeah, that's some really good suggestions. Thank you, Wendy. And there's a couple of more comments in the chat. So Eliza, again, commenting on just the difficulties under our funding model in Australia to get good funding for genetic counsellors, because I think the need for this workforce is absolutely there. And the way that we fund this type of provision is so piecemeal in Australia. It's sort of a mix of activity-based funding. If a local hospital district can make it happen, there's some in the private sector. We've got Medicare funding for when it's a sort of test or device, and it's really challenging to make what a genetic counsellor does fit the existing structures. And so it's a really clear example of we've got to put our heads together and come up with a good way of ensuring this support is there going forward for genomics to be sustainable in Australian healthcare going forward. And Eliza has a separate question around potential risks or harm of handing over data, particularly if parents are accessing and turning it over for their children, including perhaps depositing it with a third-party interpretation service. I think it's possibly slightly beyond our scope for today, but I think it's a really important question to think about, you know, what happens to this data after we let go of it. And I know that there is an excellent MRFF project that Jane Nielsen is leading at the University of Tasmania. And I think Chris and Eliza, you've been quite closely involved in that project around some of these implications of returning raw data. And Wendy, your comments about terminology, I'm so on board. It is also really hard. I know Matilda, I think, is on the call, and Kitty's here too. And we've had a separate terminology project underway with Australian Genomics this year to try and work out what to do with findings beyond the initial test indication, and even getting to agreed terminology there, where there are already a good set of terms out there to kind of pick from is really hard to really make sure that we've got good consensus. Sorry, Kitty, did you want to add something there?
The co-design challenge is important, you know, finding an appropriate way to get people seated at the table was not easy.
Yeah, and to do it in a way that is genuinely meaningful and offering like good engagement. It's about relationship building. It needs time, it needs resourcing. And not to say we shouldn't do it by any stretch of the imagination, it's so important, but it's something that needs to be planned really carefully, and I think needs top-down governance and leadership to make it happen. Absolutely. Okay, we are nearly at time. So what I will do as a final thing is just to ask both of our speakers whether they have any kind of final take-home ponderings. Is there anything you wanted to say but didn't get a chance to say, or is there anything that's really stuck out to you from our conversation today? Wendy, I'll ask you first.
I think my main point is that this is an area that is desperately overdue for law reform. Really, the closest we've come in the last several decades has been looking at the genetic privacy implications. It's now bigger than that. It's now looking at drawing together tangible biospecimens and intangible genetic data. It's bringing in familial implications that didn't even exist at the time the legislation was drafted. It is very much overdue for an overhaul. And I think the longer we put it off, the more it's going to be a lost opportunity, and the more the incoherence and the potential for actually harming and causing significant damage to researchers and sources and participants is just going to become further entrenched.
Thank you. Megan.
I just like to qualify when I said give the raw data to the patient. I was thinking the data from the molecular profiling. And the elephant in the room there is the person they would probably show it to is their oncologist, who's going to understand it as little as the patient. And so given the growth of importance of this area, it hasn't been mentioned, but I think the reality of mainstreaming means that all efforts to educate generalists with regard to interpretation of genetic data or improved channels by which they can get the information they need to understand it will be very important as part of this process. But having been involved in eliciting the voice of the patient through our studies in PiGeOn, I very strongly endorse the need for co-design, because it's definitely the case that the views of patients and the views of those who care for them are not aligned. But thank you, Ainsley, for the opportunity to report those findings.
Yeah, thank you. So it just remains to say thank you to everyone, to our two fantastic speakers, and to Australian Genomics for enabling this to happen, and to Kitty for her support behind the scenes, and to all of you for coming today or watching us online. Thank you so much. That is our final seminar for 2023. It seems weird to say this at the start of November, but best wishes for a safe, festive season and for what comes next for genomics in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.